people of the adult population that could work did work, and even more importantly, in terms of improving the wealth as opposed to the size of the country, that they are all as productive as possible. And that research, as simple as it is, has led to an explosion of interest in this concept of BRICS. And indeed, in the 5 years since we first looked at this and the 3 years since we first looked at it in detail, those four economies have all actually grown by more than we assumed. And actually, in the past 5 years, 30% of world growth has actually originated from those BRICS countries. And many of the people in those countries are starting to see their wealth improve very quickly. Late last year, in response to a lot of comments about our BRICS concept, we introduced another paper in which we added on another 11 big developing countries, which we called collectively the N11. And we looked at those to try and address whether there were other large population countries that could get to the same potential. And in them includes many important large countries in Africa and Asia. And we showed that none of those have the same potential as the BRICS countries in terms of absolute size, but in terms of a rapid improvement in their economic capability and their, most importantly in terms of getting rid of poverty, the average wealth per person, that if those countries fulfill the two criteria, and in particular raise their productivity standards, there would be a dramatic improvement by 2050 in many of those countries' wealth. And the reason why I asked you at the start of how many of you thought Italy was wealthy, right now Italy's average GDP per capita is around about $30,000 to $32,000 per head. At the same time, we have in, for example, Egypt, just over $1,000. If Egypt fulfills its potential, by 2050, according to our calculations, Egypt could have its average GDP per capita about half the level of Italy. And a similar kind of analysis can be applied to many other big countries within the N11. We've looked at Nigeria, Iran, Indonesia, and varying magnitudes of different countries. But the best way to boost these countries' performance and the average wealth of all those countries' citizens is quite simply to boost all the factors that lead to an improvement in the productivity of those people. And that is the best way to get rid of poverty. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Mainstream media and elsewhere. To read the media nowadays, you'd think that Gordon Blair and Tony Brown were the champions of poverty reduction in Africa and elsewhere. And you might think that global free trade was the great solution to global poverty. I mean, I think these are fundamental myths that should be exploded. I wanted to really start by looking at, well, where has poverty actually been eradicated successfully? Because this is often overlooked. And there's some very interesting studies by the UN, by the UNDP, the UN Development Programme, and by UNICEF, that look at the what they call the high achieving countries over the last 10 to 20 years. And these are countries like Costa Rica, Cuba, Barbados, Botswana, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, South Korea, and Malaysia. These are what they call the highest achieving countries, who within a generation have achieved the kind of health and education fundamental changes that it took 200 years to achieve in this country and elsewhere. The key question is, well, how have they done it? Well, the interesting thing, first of all, is that there's no single model. There's no blueprint to be pursued everywhere. Everywhere is different. That's the first important conclusion. But there are some common elements that are shared across these countries, such as the preeminent role of the state. And I'm quoting here directly from the UN report, the preeminent role of the state in ensuring that the vast majority of the population have access to basic social services. There's major investments in health and education as a major priority for the state. There is considerable focus on gender equity and particularly targeted interventions to bring women up to the same level as men in terms of health and educational opportunities. And there's specific policies to address inequality within countries as well. Now, what these countries show is not that the free market, free trade model is the one that works. I mean, in these countries, hardly any of these countries have actually promoted that model, and you could make a good case to say that none of them have actually. And yet, the model being imposed on most of the rest of the world as we speak, through the World Trade Organization, through the World Bank, through the International Monetary Fund, through the United States, through the British government, is pretty much the opposite of what these countries' experience has been. It is a neoliberal economic model that promotes privatization, free trade, and deregulation of corporations. And I would suggest that all the evidence, and again there's a wealth of evidence from the UN, would suggest that if you look at the outcome of that model in the countries that have promoted that model, it has been invariably one of increasing poverty and inequality. The most dramatic case of successful poverty eradication over the last 50 years has been South Korea, which 50 years ago was as poor as Sudan, amazing though that is to believe, and now it has almost European levels of GDP. Now there's been a fierce intellectual